Thank you. I just had to throw a pin away today, so good timing.
Good morning, everybody.
Thank you.
Pre-Christmas.
Everybody find a seat. We'll get started.
Reliable pens. I've had these.
We're going to sing This Is My
Three
Father's
or four now.
World. Everybody got music? Question today. It's a two-parter, but if you can't get both parts, I might allow the winner to have one of those right. On this particular day, the very first presidential speech was televised on TV. On this day, so your answers need to be the year and the president that did it. Louise?
Was it 1947 in Truman?
Yeah! 1947 Truman, Harry Truman. How'd you know? Did you look on the internet today? She wanted that Chick-fil-A. She checked the internet this morning. Good job. Good job. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So Donna is at the eye doctor and was at the eye doctor. She thinks she could be here today. So I've got jokes for you this morning.
Oh boy.
So even if you don't think they're funny, you need to laugh.
You don't have
Because it might have been something that she's done and I don't remember. So anyway, this is called Married 4 Times. Married 4 times. The local news station was interviewing an 80-year-old lady because she had just gotten married for the 4th time. The interviewer asked her questions about her life, about what it felt like to be marrying again at 80, and then about her new husband's occupation. He's a funeral director, she answered. Interesting, the newsman thought. He then asked her if she wouldn't mind telling him a little about her first 3 husbands and what they did for a living. She paused for a few moments, needing time to reflect on all those years. After a short time, a smile came to her face, and she answered proudly, explaining that she had married a banker when she was in her 20s, then a circus ringmaster in her 40s, and a preacher in her 60s, and now, in her 80s, a funeral director. The interviewer looked at her quite astonished and asked why she had married 4 men with such diverse careers. She smiled and explained, "I married 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, and 4 to go." Y'all laughed. Y'all laughed. Yes. All right. Nice. I thought that was funny. And then this other one is called, well, it's not called anything. It just is. There was this little old lady who was late for church. She's going 65 on a street where the speed limit is 40. It didn't take long before a policeman pulls her over and says, "Ma'am, can I see your license, please?" And she says, "I'm sorry, officer, but it got revoked 2 years ago for drunk driving." He tries again, "Well, then can I please see your registration?" And she hangs her head and says, "I apologize, officer. I stole the car and I killed the driver. He's in the trunk. I feel so bad." He said, "Ma'am, don't move." The officer frantically calls into his walkie-talkie. Within minutes, there are sirens blaring, lights flashing, half a dozen police cars are surrounding the woman's car, and the chief of police steps out and walks over to the woman's window. "Ma'am, can I see your license, please?" "Of course, officer." She smiles sweetly and pulls out a license from her purse. He squints at it and said, "This looks good. Can I see your registration?" And she reaches into her purse again and hands it to him. He looks at it and then back to her. "Ma'am, can you pop the trunk, please?" "Certainly, officer." He steps back, but it's completely empty. And the little old lady shakes her finger at the first officer and says accusingly, "And I'll bet that liar told you I was speeding too."
Remember that one?
Yes. All right. All right. Brittany wanted to remind you that she still is in desperate need of some trunks for trunk or treat, and of course lots of candy. And then she's also looking for childcare. If anybody likes to keep kids on a Monday morning from 10 to 12 every other week. She's still in need of that desperately. And the White Christmas tickets are on sale. You can go to your Church Center app. I've got a bunch already signed up, but we sell a few more tickets. And there's 4 shows already sold out, so they're going to go quickly. So if you want to go, you can go to the Church Center app, or you can pay me directly for $20. That includes a lunch and a play that day. All right, thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think about Steve and his comedy routine?
You got a little competition in that.
I know. It's like, we'll have a joke off next time between you and Donna.
No, she'll take it.
Yeah, yeah, she's had a little bit more experience than you have in that area. But I like your style. I like the long jokes with the delivery at the end. So the 1 for the money one was good. The second one I didn't even follow. So I saw everybody laughing. I was like, maybe you've been there before. I don't want to be the only one. So, speaking of following along, here we are in Esther. This is our 8th week, and we're actually in chapter 8, I believe. So things are lining up, hopefully, for us. I'm not sure how that happened, but that's where we are today. And you have noticed I've dressed up a little bit for the occasion. Yeah, you know, if I feel like the lesson's not that strong, I try to improve my appearance to make it a little bit better. No, actually, today the plan is I'm supposed to be officiating a service for Mr. George Gay, who was Miss Brown, Gail Brown's dad. So the Brown family and the Watson family are 2 families that we've seen recently more and more of. They've been visiting week after week, and their boys both have been baptized recently. So we've had in September, every week, we've had someone baptized. And so most of them are kids between the age of 10 and 14, basically, which is around the time people start to understand salvation. And so 2 of the boys in that family were baptized. And so then that whole family, too, has been talking about wanting to join Avalon, place membership here. And we had actually planned for that to happen a couple weeks ago. And on that week was when all kinds of sickness hit the family. And then, of course, Mr. George passed this past Sunday night, I believe. And it's just remarkable how when stuff like this happens, and I've seen this, I've been in ministry long enough to warn people, you know, when things are improving in terms of your relationship with God or with church, and you're just trying to get things, you know, onto another level, that's when other things will ramp up. Distractions and discouragement will potentially come around to keep you from moving the direction you guys are moving in. So that's what's happened. And typically, I try to avoid doing services for people who aren't necessarily even members of Avalon or connected in some way. But because of this special circumstance with this family, I agreed to do it. And I think it speaks volumes too that a number of y'all were willing to provide food for the family following the service as well. You know, the service helps in some way. It's good to kind of reflect together, but really the key part of a time like this are the interactions that you have with loved ones and friends that come around and comfort you in that way. And then for many of us who may be strangers so far to this Brown family, to reach out and care for them at this crucial time, this is what church is for. So what you're doing is very much ministry and it's outreach. And so I appreciate Miss Kathy, as usual, stepping in. And this was short notice, so I actually said I'm totally unavailable this weekend because I had other plans with the family to do some things. And they said, well, if we can pull it off Wednesday or Thursday. So he passed Sunday night, found out about it Monday. They said, if we can figure out Wednesday or Thursday, would you be available? And I said, yeah, we can probably work that out. And so sure enough, they figured out how to get the service together today. And then Miss Kathy was called in probably a day after that. And so the quick turnaround and you guys mobilizing on that, it is a ministry. And it's going towards a family that is trying to grow in their relationship with the Lord and also with us as a church as well. So,
And
yes.
The mom, the daughter, she's also been part of helping bring food for other people's
yeah,
and
yeah.
meals.
Yeah, Gail.
So she's already been very involved.
So you may have met Gail Brown or Richard Brown. So George's daughter is Gail, and her husband Richard. They live right around the corner on Indian River. I forget the street they live off of. Clinton. Yeah. So like 4 or 5 minutes away. But their whole tribe kind of lives in this house. So George was there for a while in this section of the house called the West Wing, they call it, that they kind of finished for him. And so Gail and Richard. And then we have JJ and Christina Watson. JJ is a sergeant on the Virginia Beach Police Force. Christina works with animal rescue in the same area. And then that's the couple that has the boys that were baptized. So they have 3 boys and a daughter. And then on the other side, so Gail's son, Jacob Brown, and his wife, Shana. That's how you say it, right, Steve? Shana or Shana? They also have kids. And so that whole family, extended family, has been coming. And they're looking to join all together. So look for that. If you're at the service that they're attending when they join, we're hoping that will continue to move forward despite discouragement or distraction, because it's just opportunity for us as a church to take care of people.
They
So.
also went to the Discovering Avalon class that Tyler just did.
Yeah,
And I went along because I like
Sure.
to meet new people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Keep them straight.
right. Yeah,
But they filled up the room. I mean,
Yeah.
all of them were there,
yeah,
except
Yeah.
for grandchildren. But
of course.
all the kids were there. I mean, that was a nice thing.
Yeah, Tyler said, so Discovering Avalon is the class that we do for folks who are just wanting to learn about Avalon, but also some of the basics that we teach and doctrine and things like that. So the class runs somewhere around 9-10 weeks, something like that. And he said something like, at some points there was like 17 people in there. Of course, the majority of them were in this particular family. But that's exciting. It's great to see that there's still new people coming along and they're interested, not just in attending, but getting involved. And so we're encouraging that. So be praying for this family and then also just what's coming from the ministry opportunity we have today. So back to Esther. This actually leads into a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. She lives centuries ago among a people and a culture that we have never seen. We can only hear of from historians and also from Scripture. And so names and places and cultures change, but the principles that worked back then still remain true for us today. The things that we are learning from the experiences of these people who lived in a very different time and place are still very much appropriate for how we do life, how we figure out doing life even today in our culture, in our time. One aspect of that is the age-old struggle of good versus evil. And you can see the lines being drawn between good and evil, between Haman and Mordecai. But then you can also see other powers at play behind the scenes with God's providence between the struggle between good and evil as well. And of course, good won in Esther's day, and that is a foreshadowing of what we can expect in our day as well. You can see how much stress Esther and her people went through. And you can see how late it seemed that God stepped into a situation, but God did, and He redeemed it in such a dramatic and amazing way. We can be encouraged by that as well, even if we feel like we're at the very end of the time of stress that we may be facing. So no wall that evil builds up, no matter how high or thick, can stand against God's power to destroy. God destroys the powers of evil. God destroys the structures of evil. And He does it in ways that are so unpredictable. So what are some ways or examples of walls that evil builds? What types of, what areas of life does evil discouragement and distraction come after? Yes? Relationships are a big part of that. Okay, so relational walls are built when evil comes in and can sometimes separate or divide people. Good example. Emotional damage can happen when evil takes shape in our life. Emotional walls. And then, of course, physical walls of evil have been built and exists. We can see that between nations even. With wars that take place, some for the result of greed or power. And so this is how evil can have an effect in our life, building these types of walls. And as I was talking about, just with this family, the example of this family who wants to move forward in their relationship with Christ and His church, you have all of these distractions and difficulties, sickness, and even dealing with death that come up that go right along with or right around the time that these people are trying to move forward. So we expect that to happen, but God still has final victory. And as I was talking about, I think the victory in this particular circumstance is how the church can come through and help this family through this time. So what became an obstacle turns into an opportunity. So all walls finally fall. And you think about it on a political level, Roman, German, Egyptian, Russian, whatever, doesn't necessarily matter if any force be opposed to God, then God would put an end to that particular evil in the world at some point or another. So you ask the question, why even build walls in the first place? Robert Frost has this good quote, "Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out." Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out. You think about the time that the Israelites spent in slavery for over 400 years. Around 430 years they were in slavery. They were held in by the walls of Egypt, not necessarily just physically, but they couldn't scale the wall of Egypt. But the slavery that they found themselves in was a power greater than their ability to break free from. It took a number of plagues, even on God's part, to break those walls open. So it took God's direct intervention in that example to break down those walls. Obvious example, the walls of Jericho, keeping the Israelites away from the promised land. So you see these examples, whether they're physical or political or emotional or relational, any of those aspects, you can see these things happen. This is what it looks like when good and evil are battling one another. Walls are built up and broken down in that exchange. So here are some walls between us and God that we're going to see being broken down as we go through this lesson. And so it starts in Ephesians 2, which talks about how God breaks down these walls. Verse 14, He Himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in His flesh the law with its commands and regulations. Great text out of the New Testament, Ephesians 2, which talks about how these walls are being brought down, specifically by the gospel, the story, the effect of what Jesus did on the cross for us. Now you ask yourself, what does this have to do with Esther? All this happened before the cross happened, a while after these events in Esther. Well, chapter 8 is a chapter where a heart is so hard it seemed it would never change, but we can see that the heart does change in chapter 8. So one of the walls that's broken down is an unchangeable heart, and that's where we pick things up in Esther chapter 8, verse 1. The same day is what? You guys remember where we left things off?
Probably Haman demolished.
Yes. Haman's on the pole. Yeah, he's on a pole, 75 feet up in the air. And on that same day, it says, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So what a quick change. Remember, Mordecai had just been at the king's gate, and that's kind of where he planted himself, as close as he could get to the center of power, but then also still be connected with his people, the Jews who were dealing with the opposition in Persia. So he was kind of the go-between. If you remember, when the story began, it was the king who was the front and center of attention. In Esther 1:1, it begins with, the very book begins with, this is what happened during the time of King Xerxes. The focus was on him as being the most powerful man in the world at that time to help us see the situation Esther found herself in. This man was so powerful that he could cause people to live or die by the wave of his hand, or I guess scepter is another way. If you'll remember, that was part of the concern that Esther had in approaching the king, was that if he did not extend his scepter towards her, that there was a standing order with his guards to kill whoever tried to approach the king. And if you'll remember at the very beginning, this is the king that got rid of his wife simply because she didn't make him happy at the party around his friends. She embarrassed him in front of his friends, and so she was done away with, essentially, banished from the throne. This is the king that we're talking about here in verse 1. And not too long ago, this is the same guy who had assented to ridding this whole land of a whole race of people just because they got in Haman's way. He didn't have much concern for life, specifically Jewish life in his kingdom. But yet, what we see now is a changed man. Here is a man who's willing to give up half of his kingdom to Esther. I don't think that those were just empty words that he was promising her. And we have Haman, who was basically his prime minister. In other words, he was going to kind of be the king and then have his own prime minister kind of rule things for him, Xerxes. But that didn't go so well, right? Everything changed very quickly. And so then Haman's entire estate is given to Esther. And Esther, in turn, passed that on to Mordecai, who is now actually in the king's presence. So much changed very quickly. And it wasn't just a result of Esther's effort or the king's decision. It had very much to do with God's sovereign providence and how it showed up in the circumstance. At the very last seemingly possible moment for things to change. In fact, some would say, past the time for things to change. Here's what we mean. Verse 2, the king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. Remember the signet ring? We talked about how important that was. That was kind of the blank check from the king on you can make whatever laws you'd like to make and spend money however you'd like to spend it. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. And so even though Mordecai has the signet ring and he can make any law basically he'd like, there's still a problem with the law that is already in place. We keep bringing up this text from Proverbs 21, 1 and 2, which speaks to God's providence over political affairs or rulers in this world, where it says in verse 1, in the Lord's hand the king's heart is a stream of water that he channels towards all who please him. A person may think their own ways are right, but the Lord weighs the heart. Maybe there's people who may not be as powerful as King Xerxes or Haman was, but people in your life who have only one goal, and that's to make your life miserable. And they're after you, and they're trying their hardest to make your life miserable. And whenever you need comfort, put someone else's name in the place of the king in this verse. In the Lord's hand is blank's heart, a stream of water that he channels towards all who please him. A person may think their own ways are right, the Lord weighs the heart. There is no heart too stubborn for the Lord. There's no circumstance that is too difficult, not too difficult to unravel. And we're going to see this happen right here before us here as we continue in Esther 8. So here's the problem. You have this irrevocable edict, a law that cannot be changed. This is the Persian way. If something goes into law, doesn't matter what effect it will eventually have, it will be seen through. So Haman, the person who enacted the thing, may be gone, but his edict is still in place. That's a blank. Edict. That's a fancy word for law or command. And it was known that these could not be rescinded. There's several references to this in Daniel 6. Of course, Daniel takes place in the time of the Persian Empire. And Nebuchadnezzar, being the Persian boss for Xerxes, was putting out edicts constantly. And so you can see examples of that. But Esther, knowing that the Jews would die in December if something doesn't change with this edict, is now weeping before the king. Something has to happen. And I'm not even sure if she knows what can happen. She is just desperate for something to happen because, if you remember, they put the date on the calendar when the Jews would be exterminated among the Persian Empire. That was part of the edict. It was like, on this day, here it comes. So, verse 4, the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, notice this is how you talk to a king back then, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all kings' provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I've given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So what Esther is asking for was unique. It was unheard of in those times. Everybody knew about an edict that could not be rescinded. Nobody thought about an edict that could trump an edict that came before it, that could overrule the one that came before. So the king hands the pen to write another edict that would revoke the first, in effect, not saying the law is no longer in effect, but basically saying this is the new law, and we're going to see what the new law looks like. And this is a great example of why we should stand up for God in situations that seem like they will never change. We don't see the way out, but we trust the God who creates the way out that we may not see. And so Esther kind of sees seemingly far enough that she knows this is part of the solution. If we can come up with a law that counteracts the effects of the first law, we don't have to rescind the first law. So this is how it goes down. Verse 9. At once the royal secretaries were summoned. So these are all the lawyers. On the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, they wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. That's the number we were given of the prior edict, and all the lands really known in the world at that time. That's how big the Persian Empire was. These orders were written in the script of each province, the language of each of the people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. That's important. See the difference there. And then Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers riding the royal horses went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. So the message goes out. Quickest horses, the fastest, the finest horses of the kingdom, with the authority of the king itself. Because it's going to be hard to believe that all this has gone down, right? Think you're in a Jew in the outstretches of Africa and somewhere trying to hear about what's going on in Persia, and you're just counting down the days on the calendar for certain destruction, and you don't know anything of this Haman or impalement or any of those things. And so news has to get out quickly, because there are a number of people discouraged and really have no hope. And so, even though the law could never be changed, the king provided the way for the law to be neutralized, as we talked about. So then it shows that the Jews had 3 months, that's a blank, 3 months to prepare to defend themselves. And not only are they allowed to defend themselves, they're allowed to take property from their attackers in the same way that Esther took it from Haman. So God is saying, here is how we're going to get out of this. You're going to be able to defend yourself, and so get ready. So you got 3 months to train to do this, and here's the motivation. You will no longer be slaves in this area, but you can actually take over if these people come after you. And so the message goes out, and people who already know this about God are reassured in that belief that He's in control. He stays, He remains as our shelter in difficult times, just like He was in the furnace in the book of Daniel. So God is able to break down the wall of the impenetrable hearts and irrevocable edicts. And now we're going to see Him break through impenetrable gloom. After Haman's edict was passed, the atmosphere in the land was probably a lot like the atmosphere in Auschwitz, or in places where the German government was identifying who the Jewish people were, and then the businesses were then being boycotted, and things were starting to escalate and move forward. And then you start hearing of these camps that exist, and you have these people in this place of despair where every day you were that much closer to certain doom. This is the kind of environment that existed in Persia before these horses with this news reached them. But then you see, as the news gets out, what happens. Verse 15. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. So, once the edict goes out that they can arm themselves and defend themselves, now all of a sudden, people are jumping sides. So this, for the Jewish people, was like Thanksgiving, New Year's, Christmas, all rolled in one. They were certain to have been destroyed, and now, not only are they saved, but they are put in a place of honor as a people. So much so that people were converting to Judaism as a result of what they saw. The darkness was lifted. It was a blank. And how quickly that change happened for them. They had been waiting for weeks and months. Mordecai had been waiting for years for this to turn around, and how suddenly it all happened. So this is the Feast of Purim. Points back to this freedom that they saw. So we can sometimes be living in darkness and no one might notice, but God always knows where we are, what's going on in our hearts. So remember, Esther's story is not some irrelevant fairy tale. Its principles still hold true for us today. This chapter announces in bold letters that there is hope. There's hope. Because God is always in the business of breaking down stubborn walls, and that can happen on any day. One surprising wall that you may not have thought about could be your own stubborn will. We always like to think of ourselves as the good guys who are in despair or facing trouble, but sometimes we create our own walls. Sometimes our own stubbornness can do that as well, and God can break those down as well. Sometimes it's painful too. A.W. Tozer has said, "It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply." My guess is many of us in this room have lived a long enough life to know what that means and what that looks like. After a time of despair, we can sometimes find ourselves in a time of joy that we would not have experienced had we not gone through the struggle. And it's interesting that people became Jews after the celebration of God's people. It then becomes infectious, right? When things change like that and there's that much joy. Here's from the book. When, because of your faith, your life too becomes perceptibly different. When your reactions are quite opposite to what the situation seems to call for, and your activities can no longer be explained in terms of your personality, that is when your neighborhood will sit up and take notice. In the eyes of the world, it's not our relationship with Jesus Christ that counts. It's our resemblance to Him. In the midst of circumstances that look like certain defeat, there is no more powerful testimony than the joy produced by faith. And so even though Esther was exhausted as she went to bed that night, she was satisfied that she had done the Lord's will at great risk, and she could probably still hear her people partying in the streets as a result of her standing up for what she knew she had to do for such a time as this that God had put her in. So an encouraging thing for us, hopefully, regardless of whether or not you're on your way into problems or on your way out of problems or right in the middle of problems. Always know that God has the power to break down walls of discouragement, despair, and even of obstinacy sometimes that we put up ourselves. Okay, so that's what I have for you today. Let's talk a little bit about prayer before we pray. Some things that maybe we can be praying for.